back to the third part of the 2008 Brown Club ballot measure debates. Our next measure is Measure 59. The ballot title is Creates an Unlimited Deduction for Federal Income Taxes on Individual Taxpayers' Oregon Income Tax Returns. Speaking in favor is Russ Walker, the Northwest Director of Freedom Works and Vice Chair of the Republican Party of Oregon. In opposition, we have Mike Leachman, Senior Policy Analyst of the Oregon Center for Public Policy. Russ?
Yeah, let me just state that I'm here in my capacity as the Northwest Director of Freedom Works and not as the Vice Chairman of the State Republican Party for the Republican Party. So let me just touch on what I think are the major points and give you first a little background on Ballot Measure 59. Ballot Measure 59 is intended to correct a fairness issue which exists in Oregon's tax code. Currently, Oregon's tax code allows those making up to roughly about $42,000, $45,000 a year. Mike probably be more specific about that. Households making up to $42,000, $45,000 a year currently get full deductibility on their federal income taxes, on their state taxes paid. What this ballot measure does is it extends that exact same benefit in the tax code out to all taxpayers, regardless of their income level. And so it is a fairness issue. What it does, it changes the code so that no one is double taxed in the state of Oregon, which is what is currently happening to those who pay federal taxes and then are taxed again on money that they don't see in their pocketbook. It goes to the state, it goes to the federal government. It also provides a stimulus to the general economy. Although I don't agree with the figure in $2.4 billion, I'm not really sure where that comes from. I think the more accurate figure is about 1.3 billion, 1.2. But if we want to go with 2.4, that's fine. $2.4 billion of money that gets to stay in the hands of private consumers and then spent within the general economy of Oregon, which I think is a good stimulus. It's definitely timely, considering the current state of the economy. There is even discussion today by the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. to grant another stimulus to taxpayers. So I don't think, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, most people believe that a stimulus is required at this time. This provides Oregonians with an additional stimulus. Finally, probably the last thing I'll mention is it brings fairness to the system and stops the practice of penalizing people for making money. And I think that's a real problem in our tax code. If you look at Oregon's tax code, we have one of the highest capital gains taxes in the country. We have a very high income tax that kicks in at a very low income level. Our tax code needs general work across the board. We believe this is a start. Those who make more money, of course, are penalized more under the current code, and this would stop that effect, at least on the double taxation of income. And I think that's all the time I need for my introduction.
Mike?
Great. First, thanks to the Brown Club for putting the event together. The exact cost of Measure 59 would depend on what happens with the Bush tax cuts, but let's just say that it would be in excess of $1 billion. To give you a sense of the magnitude, even if it is at that low end, the revenue hit is equivalent to how much Oregon spends on its public universities in total, or cutting the salaries of all of our K-12 public school teachers by 70%. Mr. Walker hasn't told us exactly what cuts he would make to cover the bigger than $1 billion hole. It's hard to see how our schools and universities would be able to absorb substantial cuts like that and still be able to produce an education system that will make Oregon competitive in the future or fix our broken healthcare system. Nearly all of our state budget goes to education and healthcare and public safety. Do we really think that we have too much of these things? Moreover, Measure 59 is just it's a solution in search of a problem. The federal government and the state government both use our income, the income that we make, as the basis for determining what our income taxes are. There's nothing fundamentally unfair about that. The same thing's true about our property tax system. The schools, the city government, county use the assessed value of your home when determining how much property taxes you should pay. In and of itself, there's nothing unfair about that. What matters is how much you pay in taxes. It doesn't matter how many times you're taxed. What people care about is what is your tax. So let's talk about something that really is fundamentally unfair about Oregon's tax system. Under our current system, the wealthiest Oregonians pay a smaller share of their income in state and local taxes than middle-class Oregonians or even the poor. And that is something that's fundamentally unfair about our current system, and Measure 59 would just make that worse. Under Measure 59, 78% of Oregon households would get no tax break. I'm going to say that again because I think it's the most important point. 3 out of 4 of us, 78% of Oregon households would get no tax break from Measure 59. And since what really matters here, the real fairness issue is how much you pay in taxes, Measure 59 suggests that its proponents think that most Oregonians don't need a tax break, but that the richest Oregonians need a very large one. Half of the total tax break, this very large tax break, would go to the highest income 1% of Oregonians. That's a group that already has average incomes of over $1 million. That means each year we would take hundreds of millions of dollars out of our schools, out of our healthcare system, out of our public safety systems, and send it to people who are already millionaires. This is not an economic stimulus. First of all, the measure doesn't even take effect until 2010. And second, to the extent that it creates any jobs, it comes at a very high cost. The only economic analysis that's been done of the jobs that would be created was done by the Nonpartisan Legislative Revenue Office, and they found that it would, number one, the economic impact would be to reduce wages and increase inequality in the state, and the number of in terms of the number of jobs, considering the cost, it would be over $300,000 per job. We can do better than that. We can come up with a better form of stimulus than this. And finally, I just want to remind everyone that Oregon voters already said no to essentially this same idea 8 years ago.
Thank you. Now for questions.
It seems to me there are two peculiar things about Oregon state income tax code. One is that above about $5,000 you have a dead flat tax, which is far more regressive than what you have in the federal income tax, which is progressive, and one of the few progressive taxes there are. And the other thing is the fact that the income tax is not deductible above $5,000, or is limited above $5,000. Why don't you just change the tax to a progressive tax above $5,000 and get rid of this thing which complicates the tax code and makes it difficult to predict what your income tax is actually going to be and what your income is going to be?
You had a question to me?
Actually, it's for Mike.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
Okay. I mean, we would certainly support a restructuring of our income tax code to make it more progressive than it currently is. As I said, the overall state and local tax system, you look at property taxes, excise taxes, and income taxes, is regressive in Oregon. That means it's upside down, as you know, and the relative flatness of our income tax system is part of the reason why.
Yeah, just one comment to that. I would be happy to have a debate about real tax reform in Oregon. Unfortunately, we've been unable to have that debate at the Capitol. We've been unable to have that debate in legislative process, and it is a systematic problem at the legislature. They won't address the real taxing problems in Oregon. If you look at the assessment of where we are on taxes by the Tax Foundation, we fall roughly behind the middle of all the states in total taxes. What that only tells you is our limited mix of taxes: property, income, sales, capital gains. What it doesn't tell you is that Oregon is always ranks in the top 10 in spending per capita. So we have this kind of unique way of getting money. We have all these little scams by which we get money out of taxpayers. System development charges, all kinds of little fees. I mean, we had dozens and dozens of fees to the tune of roughly $1 billion that passed through our last legislative session that all are essentially taxes on Oregonians. And that's how we raise our money. What we need to do is have a debate about taxes. And unfortunately what this is another form of a scheme. It's a scheme to double tax people who are in the higher tax brackets, and we want to end that. We need to have a transparent tax policy in the state of Oregon. We currently don't have that today. And it's really unfortunate because it makes it really hard for people to make decisions on whether or not they locate businesses here in the state of Oregon, or whether or not they just choose another state that's more transparent and more fair in their tax codes.
I just have to say, we've looked at our state and local tax system, compared it to others. Our system, even when you include fees, we're in the middle of the pack. If you just look at taxes, we're at the bottom. We're a low tax state. But if you include fees, and I agree that you should, that's the fair way to do it, we're in the middle of the pack. We're not in the top 10.
We're in the top 10 on spending. That money comes from somewhere. It doesn't just arrive out of nowhere in our budgets.
No, our spending is also down in the middle of the pack, and as a share of personal income, our both spending and revenue have been fluctuating around a very similar level for the last 25 years or so.
This is one of the tricks that they use in the budgeting process in the state of Oregon and in most states. They don't talk about all the dollars we spend in state government. When you often hear numbers thrown out, they talk about either general government money. They don't talk about all funds. This is a means by which they have to limit the total amount that we actually spend and pretend it's much smaller than it actually is. Our state budget currently today roughly is $49 billion. It's been downgraded a little bit to I think 48.5. That's a $4+ billion increase over the last legislative cycle. That represents a 10% increase. So, I mean, the numbers are kind of funny in the way that the state likes to look at their numbers. They don't like to include all their numbers in everything they use.
Next question, please.
I'd like to say, first of all, I've been in Oregon for 14 years, and I'm really getting tired of voting on the same initiatives again and again and again. So that's just a comment. In those 15 years, my children started first grade, and now the last one is about to graduate from high school. And this past couple of years has been the first couple of years when people's hearts weren't in their stomachs thinking about potential cuts for teachers for the next year, and where there weren't emergency measures being taken, and people going nuts over that question. So my question is, if this goes through, how are you going to plug the hole that's left in paying for what, after all, has to happen in the state for things to go on a daily basis the way they have been? What are you going to do about that? Where's that money going to come from if it doesn't come from taxpayers?
Okay. That's a good question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because some of this was brought up in Mike's introduction. I think it's important we address it. The state of Oregon has plenty of money to spend on its core services. What we don't do is we don't spend it well. And I'll give you one example, and I can give you dozens of examples if you want, but in the interest of time, I'll give you one. Back in 2003, we worked on PERS reform. And if you remember that debate, PERS was closing on, PERS is the Public Employee Retirement System. It was closing on 20+% of payroll. For every school district, every fire department, every public service spent 20 to 25% of payroll on retirement benefits for their employees. The private sector spends on an average of 5% of payroll. So we managed to get that down through our reform process down to about 18% of payroll. So the private sector somehow can make it at 5% and provide retirement benefits for their employees. And the public sector, unfortunately, can only do it for 18%. And the reason why is because when you're dealing with the public sector, you have all of these negotiations going on between the unions and their employees, or their employers, which are school boards and others. And what ends up happening is, because it's a defined benefit system, it is dependent, how they disperse those monies, what benefits are available, is entirely dependent on that negotiation process. and it's easily changed, where the private sector relies on a defined contribution system. There's a lot of ways you can cut the state budget without impacting any services to individuals.
Mike, you want to follow?
We're not going to find a billion or $2 billion from PERS. PERS has been fixed. We still keep coming back to that one, even though we've fixed it. But the question was, how are we going to fill that hole if this passes? The answer is not you're going to get it from PERS. That's not going to happen. You know that.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you other examples. For instance, the state of Oregon should be looking at private contractors to provide some of the services that we currently use public employees for. That would reduce the cost, because if you use private contractors, you wouldn't be paying 20% in PERS. I can guarantee our PERS costs will go up in these next couple of years as you see declines in the marketplace.
90% of our state budget goes to schools, to our healthcare system, and to public safety. There's no way that you can take $1 billion or $2 out of our budget and not affect those basic core services. There's just no way you can do it.
Thank you. Now for 1 minute concluding remarks.
Who's that go first?
Russ.
Okay. Yeah, you're going to hear a lot about the inability to fill the hole. And, I've been at this a long time. And for the last 10 years, I've been fighting every tax increase in Oregon. And every single legislative session, you hear the same story, that we're going to cut teachers, we're going to cut services unless we raise these taxes, or unless this tax passes. You can't possibly cut capital gains taxes. You can't possibly reform our tax code because you're going to impact services. And what ends up happening is an amazing thing happens every single session. Our budget increases by double digits every single session. And what I can promise you is you cannot maintain that level of spending into the long term. You will eventually have a problem because our personal GDP does not increase at the same rate. The taxpayers of the state of Oregon aren't seeing double-digit increases in their personal income. The growth of our economy isn't seeing double-digit increases every single 2-year period in the growth of their income. You have to control spending. There are lots of places you can cut in this budget. Am I out of time?
A few more seconds.
There are a lot of places you can cut in this budget, and I'd be happy to go through any of those places with anybody and explain to you where those specifics are. We found $1.3 billion during the Measure 30 debate. We found $1.3 billion in cuts without touching a single essential service. It can be done, and our legislators just refuse to do it.
Once again, our taxes are low relative to other states. When you include fees, as you should, we're in the middle of the pack. As a share of personal income, the revenue that we've collected in Oregon has hovered around 15% for the last 25 years. The story that Russ tells just doesn't match the facts. Measure 59 offers nothing, no tax break to 78% of Oregon households. The great bulk of the cut goes to households who are already very well off. And, this kind of strategy just isn't good for Oregon in the long run. I mean, we need a strong educational system and a good healthcare system, a solid public safety infrastructure if we're going to have a strong economy in the future. And I think Oregonians are tired of economic growth that doesn't benefit the majority of families. A measure that takes money out of systems designed to protect the common good and puts it into the pockets of millionaires is just not the way we're going to build the economy of Oregon's future.
Thank you very much. Next measure is Measure 62, amends the Constitution, allocates 15% of lottery proceeds to Public Safety Fund for crime prevention, investigation, prosecution. Speaking in favor is Alex Gardner, District Attorney-elect for Lane County. In opposition, Dana Hepper, Statewide Advocacy Coordinator for Stand for Children. Alex?
Good evening. I don't think Dana and I are going to disagree this evening about the merits of our education system or the need to support it properly. I'm pretty consistently an enthusiastic advocate for improving our education funding in Oregon. Since we're not talking about a new revenue stream here, we're talking about basically sharing a relatively small piece of an existing revenue stream. I think what this comes down to is an analysis of how severe the need is and what the comparative need is, and then how damaging, if at all, the cost to the other component will be. So the best way for me to underscore the need in our public safety system is to talk very quickly about some examples in my home jurisdiction, which is Lane County. Excuse me. Lane County is about the size of Connecticut, and it has a population of about 340,000 people. If you look at the state police staffing, for example, in 1981, there were 76 troopers stationed in Lane County. Since then, the population of Lane County has increased approximately 20%. Over those 27 years, we've dropped from 76 troopers to 26 as of last October. Now, those of you who follow this will know that the legislature authorized the hiring of 139 new troopers. Assuming Lane County gets its share of those troopers, that'll be about 12, bringing us from 26 to 38, and that'll bring us all the way up to half of what we had in 1981 when we had nothing like the crime challenges in our jurisdiction. As bad as that is, the state police is better off than the local sheriff's office. Our county, as I said, is about 4,700 square miles. So imagine an average shift where there are 2 deputies and a patrol sergeant charged with covering that entire area. To say that it's inadequate and pathetic is a gross understatement. This is a very, very dangerous situation, and our crime rates reflect that. So, for example, on TV, most of you know there's a very popular TV show called CSI. Actually, there's several of them. And when there's a dramatic crime, like a murder or something, these guys descend on the scene with Humvees and every imaginable goodie. In contrast, in Lane County, the last rural murder scene I went to investigate, I had to wait for about an hour before we had adequate police protection just to prevent people from driving through our crime scene. We had everybody the state police could offer, everybody the sheriff's office could offer, and we couldn't control the crime scene. Ultimately, we had to bring in 2 waymasters because at least they had uniforms and they had vans that had things that looked like sheriff's emblems and lights and so forth on them. They don't have guns, of course, but they're sufficiently law enforcement-like to keep people out of the area. The state of our system in law enforcement in Oregon is appalling. To think that over 27 years, the best that we can hope for is half the staffing that we had in '81 is ridiculous. What we have now is tantamount to having 90 kids in the classroom. I desperately want to see the public education system get more funding. I really do. But not at the expense of law enforcement. And frankly, since ballot measure 5 passed, we've seen a complete evisceration of the state law enforcement system. Lane County has a whopping 93 beds available. An average in the jail, an average jurisdiction of our size has somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 or 1,400. We lodged 30 people in the Lane County Jail in the first 9 months of the year on murder, attempted murder, and manslaughter alone. We can't even hold rapists predictably. It's a terribly, terribly dangerous situation, and we've been in crash mode for a long time.
Dana?
Thanks. So Alex is right. We are going to agree that the education system in Oregon is a fundamental priority that needs to be strengthened. And actually, we're also going to agree that crime prevention, investigation, and prosecution are also desperately underfunded in the state of Oregon and have been facing cut after cut after cut since the passage of ballot measure 5 and ballot measure 50 in the 1990s. And unfortunately, Measure 62's approach to solving that second problem is just deeply, deeply flawed. And I have a few reasons for that. First, Measure 62 is a constitutional amendment. So it's, of course, our legislature's job to, every 2 years, write a budget for the next 2 years. And by making this a constitutional amendment with very specific percentages for how each of the dollars need to be spent, it permanently locks in hundreds of millions of dollars that will never be available to be shifted to other priorities as those needs arise. So it's just a very strict kind of not inflexible system for writing a state budget. Second, Measure 62 takes money directly away out of our public school system. It would result in $200 million taken away from Oregon's public schools. And as a former public school teacher, I can recount firsthand what happens when Oregon has the largest elementary school class sizes in the entire nation. Our school year in Oregon is 3 weeks shorter than the national average. We are in crisis mode in our public schools as well. And with an impending recession, this is exactly the wrong time to lock in dollars that we're currently spending on education for other services. And thirdly, I'm concerned that Measure 62 actually has unintended consequences for the arena of public safety. If you cut public education and you cut job creation, which is the other area that this money is currently going to, that has the potential result of increased public safety problems down the road. And it's just with the impending economic crisis, with the recession, this is not the time to do this. Now, I would absolutely agree, again, that our prosecution services, investigation services absolutely need additional resources. Oregon's public safety spending has risen faster than any other state in the entire nation except for Florida over the past few years. So we're already dramatically increasing our spending on public safety. Now, most of that money has gone to our prison system. And so if we desperately need a source of funding for public safety, potentially we look to our priorities within the public safety budget to find those additional resources. We're actually now in Oregon spending more on our prison system than we're spending on our higher education system. And I think I'll wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions?
Do I hear crickets?
So the issue is that there's not enough money for, police and other public safety matters. Why has this gone on for so long? Where did this issue really originate? Why haven't we been putting more funds into what we need in public safety before this measure?
That's a good question. It's a fairly complicated answer. First, the precipitating event was Ballot Measure 5. And Ballot Measure 5 had a profound and not immediate impact on the property tax base. So we didn't feel the full impact for several years, and there were many efforts to find alternative taxes, but they were not successful generally. And the bottom line is that when you put public safety in competition in the general fund with kids, public safety consistently loses. If you look at the trending over time, Dana's numbers are a little bit wrong, frankly. If you look at the staffing of the Oregon State Police, for example, we're at about 9.5 troopers per 100,000 residents. That puts us at just under half of the national average. In almost every area, we're well below national average. Lane County, Oregon, has the lowest per capita police officer density in the United States, dead last. Now, there has been a substantial increase in funding on public safety, and as Dana mentioned, the lion's share of that has been in corrections. And the reason for that is because Oregon hadn't built a prison. Oregon had added, I think, 400 beds of prison capacity between 1960 and 1985. So we spent a lot of money over the last couple of years, a couple of decades, frankly, trying to catch up for failing to fund the system at all for decades. That's not to say that should be an excuse for failing to fund adequately today. As to the placement of the mechanism in the Constitution, it needs to be, that's the only alternative. That's where the lottery funds are directed. I wish it was some other way, but the public overwhelmingly passed the dedication of 15% of the lottery proceeds to fund parks I think parks are great, but if I have to choose between parks and the safety of my kids and my family, it's not a close call. And if amending the Constitution to accommodate park funding is fine, then I think it's certainly fine to do that, to fund public safety. The only other thing I'd mention is that this isn't going to cost kids education at all. The Oregon Lottery net revenue has increased at an average of 17% per biennium since its inception. We're talking about 15% dedicated to law enforcement, public safety in general, and that includes the prevention piece. So overwhelmingly, the data suggests that there will be no adverse impact on education. But even if there was an adverse impact on education, it's a small percentage of the 18% raise education got during the last legislative session. I'm talking about taking a small piece of the enormous raise that education got to mitigate a terrible situation in public safety.
Dan?
If I could respond as well. So to clarify quickly, education actually got a lower percentage increase in their budget last time around than public safety. So public safety is growing faster than public education. Of course, education is a larger share of the budget, so that's more dollars, but public safety is clearly growing much faster than education. Alex and the questioner's point about the root of this problem is incredibly important. The root of this problem is ballot measure 5 and ballot measure 50, which has restricted the funds that used to pay for these services. So I wonder why we don't propose an amendment to the Constitution that takes the money away from parks and salmon instead of from education. Or I wonder why we don't come together and propose amendments to the Constitution that change the provisions of ballot measure 5 and ballot measure 50 and begin to restore this funding at the root instead of increasingly thinly slicing a very small pie that's decreasing in the state. It just is the wrong approach. And finally, I wanted to point out that the Oregon Lottery has been historically growing at a rapid rate at about 17% per year. Unfortunately, that stopped this year. It's not growing this year. It's staying pretty much flat. And the Oregon Lottery has been growing, but it's been growing at the same time as our income tax collections have been flatlined and our property tax collections have been going down when you adjust for inflation. And so that lottery proceeds have been growing, but the overall state pie has not been. So it's a little bit misleading to say you're not going to take this money away from public schools. We're just taking the gains because those gains are not actually real when you look at the entire pie. And they won't be realized this biennium.
So I had a question. Does this ensure that public safety gets more money, or could the legislature, since they're getting more money in one place, just give less money to public safety somewhere else?
Ensure is a challenging word. There is a no supplant clause in it, and so I'm more confident about what that means at the local level. As you know, the ballot measure calls for a division of the revenue so that half of it would go to the state police and fund forensic services, lab work, the medical examiner system, and related components. Half of it goes to local jurisdictions. My belief is that as to local jurisdictions, that no supplant clause would be adequate, and I'm hopeful it would mean the same thing at the state level.
I'm not sure exactly how to respond to the supplanting question, but I would just remind us that this locks specific percentages into the Oregon Constitution, so it would take another constitutional amendment if we ever wanted to change the percentages allocated to these areas. So regardless of how much money the lottery brings in, regardless of what the stated needs are for any of these services, we've locked in a percentage for how much money they'll get, how much money these services will get from the Oregon Lottery specifically. It just doesn't seem like a smart way to budget.
In other words, it would require exactly what we're doing today. Nothing different. I mean, there's nothing magic about locking something into, or terrifying for that matter, about locking something into the Oregon Constitution. This is the vehicle that dictates how lottery revenue is spent. And so the public is being asked to consider allocating 15% of the revenue to public safety, just as it allocated 15% to parks. Now, next time, if there's sufficient support for changing that allocation, it just requires exactly what we're going through today, which is not at all a terrifying process.
That concludes our questions and answers. We have a 1-minute conclusion. Alex?
As I said initially, I feel terribly, I feel very strongly about the need to have a first-rate education system. I have family members who have been educators. I have 2 kids in the Oregon school system. I wouldn't want to do anything that diminished our ability to give our kids a first-rate education and a leg up on life. However, there's nothing more important than safety. And I've seen a terrible downturn in quality of life from the gangs moving in from out of state. Our criminal problem in Oregon is significant and getting worse. And I guess for me the question is, am I prepared to risk the loss of potentially 1% of the recent increase in education funding in order to have a huge impact on public safety? And the answer is yes.
Dana?
Oregon has been cutting funding, per student funding for public schools since 1991. We spend $400 less per student than we did that year. And last legislative session was the first time in all of those years that we saw any increase. That entire increase was $500 million. This chips away at half of that increase as soon as we've made it, and it's doing it at exactly the time that we can't afford to disinvest in public education. Because, as we all know, when we disinvest in our public schools and we disinvest in our job creation programs to the tune of $200 million, we see those disinvestments impact our public safety system down the road. We think, and I think, and a broad coalition of opponents to Measure 62 think that this measure is short-sighted, full of unintended consequences, and hurts our public schools and job creation programs just when we need them the most. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next ballot measures, gets a little bit complicated. We have 2 ballot measures, Measures 57 and Measure 61, that are on similar topics, and the way they've been written is that if they both get more than 50%, the one that actually gets more is the one that goes in law and the other one won't. So it really is an either, neither, but it's not both. So that's why we're going to be debating these side by side. And to decide who goes first, we're going to flip a quarter. So who wants to call it?
I'll call it, Steve. Let's go there.
Be my guest.
Heads.
It's tails.
Tails.
Steve, you can decide whether you're going to go first or second.
Let me look at that quarter, will you? Thank you very much. I want to thank the Brown Club of Oregon for having us here this evening to discuss this very important public safety issue with you. I think that I would like to say on the outset, actually John and I don't believe disagree fundamentally with that we have a problem with property crime. We have a problem with drug distribution and with drug manufacturing. We're just going to disagree tonight on how we get there to do something about it. Let me give you a little backdrop before we talk about the measure itself or the measures. It's important for you to know that 74% of people who are convicted of felonies in the state of Oregon, of all felony crimes, receive probation. It's important for you to know that 65% of the people who are covered under Measure 61 for these property crimes, such as burglary in the first degree, Class A and B, drug distribution and manufacturing, first degree forgery, et cetera, 65% of these people are getting probation. So this is the backdrop from which Measure 61 sprang. Currently, under current law, it takes 4 felony convictions under property crime law in order to get to prison. So you really have to work hard in Oregon in order to land yourself in the state penitentiary when you're doing property crime. What Measure 61 does to address the problem, and I should also say this, that between 1989 and 2006, Oregon was in the top 10 in property crimes. Number 1 being the highest rate of property crime, 50 being the lowest. And for 4 of those years, we bounced around between number 4 and 7. So we got as high as number 4, behind Hawaii, Arizona, and Washington. Measure 61 does the following. It calls for a mandatory minimum sentence of 36 months for people who commit first-degree burglary, who commit Class A manufacturing and Class B manufacturing and distribution of the following: heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and ecstasy. Those are the drugs it's covering. And for forgery in the first degree, the theft of a motor vehicle, first degree theft in the first degree, or burglary in the second degree, which is breaking into a business, it calls for 14 to 18 month sentences. So these are not long sentences. And by the way, there's a predicate for those. Many people said, oh, we were throwing first offenders into prison. Well, for the first crimes that I mentioned, it is for the first conviction. You're going to go to prison. Under the second set of crimes, the forgery, the burglary in the second degree, etc., you have to have 2 misdemeanors or 1 felony in order to go to prison. So that's what we're doing here. Property crime is and has been a problem in Oregon for a long time. We haven't addressed it. We've been very successful in addressing the violent crime problem, not so much with property crime. Measure 57, and I know I have exactly 57 seconds. Measure 57 takes another approach. It continues the approach of giving people probation the first time. It isn't going to give them 4 probations, but it will give them probation the first time. The second time, it allows the judge to do a downward departure. It's only the third time where it actually makes a requirement of sending these people to prison. The sentences have been lengthened. However, they still get 20 to 40% off of those sentences, so make sure you run that calculation when you look at the sentences. And last but not least, there's 2 things. One, the drug portion of the bill, for the most part, these crimes are being prosecuted in federal court. They're not going to impact the state court, so I don't even know why they put that in there. Basically, it's window dressing. It's to make the legislature look tough. Second of all, they have a drug treatment component. We applaud that. However, there's no rigor in evaluating the drug treatment component using random selection, and we have a problem with that.
Thank you. That was Steve Dole. He is the president of Crime Victims United and is in favor of Measure 61, which creates mandatory minimum prison sentences for certain theft, identity theft, forgery, drug, and burglary crimes. Next, we have John Kroger. He's Attorney General candidate and a Lewis and Clark law professor. He's speaking in favor of Measure 57. Ballot title is increases sentences for drug trafficking, theft against elderly, and specified repeated property and identity theft crimes, requires addiction treatment for certain offenses. John?
Well, hi, everybody. My name's John Kroger. I'm both the Democratic and Republican nominees for Attorney General. And I'm a law professor and former federal prosecutor. Steve and I both agree that we need to do something in the state to tackle our drug and property crimes. And Steve and I do agree on a huge range of issues. He's one of the leading crime advocates in our state, and he and I share a lot of beliefs and a lot of values. We happen to disagree on this ballot measure. The problem with ballot measure 61, the one that Steve is supporting, is I think twofold. One is that it's going to cost a huge amount of money, about $1 billion. And that's money we don't have. So it's either going to come out of education or we're going to raise taxes. And neither of those is something I think is a great idea. But at the end of the day, it's not the expense that troubles me. If someone came to me and said, look, we're going to spend $1 billion, but we're going to make everyone in the state a lot safer, I would really seriously consider it. The problem is this. The overwhelming majority of our property crimes are caused by drug addicts who are stealing to pay for their addictions. And we've got to get tougher on sentencing for property crimes, but if we ignore the importance of drug treatment, of reducing the demand for drugs, we're never going to make any progress on this issue. As a prosecutor, I saw firsthand, you can arrest dealer after dealer, but if you don't decrease the number of addicts you've got, it's impossible to reduce the crime rate. So I'm supporting the alternative, which is Measure 57. Measure 57 is supported by the majority of district attorneys in our state, by the chiefs of police, and by the frontline police officers in our state. And the reason that I support this, that the law enforcement community is supporting this, is very simple. Measure 57 does two very important things. It raises the prison sentences for repeat property offenders. Now, why is that a good idea? Right now, it takes 5 convictions for identity theft before you get a jail sentence in our state. And that's, frankly, makes it impossible to deter people from committing those crimes. So we increase the sentences for repeat offenders, not for first-time offenders. And then we couple that with the drug treatment program to make sure that we get more addicts into drug treatment so we can reduce the demand for drugs. At the end of the day, this isn't all just about property crimes. Drug abuse is the #1 cause of serious child abuse and neglect in our state. And if we're serious about reducing the number of property crimes, reducing the amount of child abuse, it's not enough to get tough on sentencing, though I think that's appropriate. We've also got to make sure that we improve our drug treatment and prevention programs. And because Measure 57 does that, I'm supporting it, and I urge citizens in the state to vote for 57 and, unfortunately, Steve, against 61. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to expand question and answers just slightly because this is a complicated issue to 10 minutes.
Hi, I'm curious as to the capacity of our correctional system to accommodate the potential outcome of this measure, or either measure if they pass.
I think I'll start with that, and then I'll let you add.
Sure.
Under either ballot measure, we're going to have to expand corrections capacity in the state. Measure 57 will require less new construction, less new prison beds than 61. But under either measure, there's going to have to be some expansion to hold more people. Is that appropriate? Look, when someone has been arrested 3 or 4 times for identity theft, they've probably committed that crime 30, 40, 50 times before they've reached that point where they're getting the 3rd or 4th conviction. If people like that have been put through drug treatment, it hasn't taken hold, they're still committing crimes, we need to incapacitate them. And that's why I think the increase in sentences for repeat property offenders is very justified under Measure 57.
Well, yes, you're going to have to expand the prison system. Now, one of the things that is called for under Measure 61 is it says that the Act requires that sentences be served in state prison facilities and work camps. So that's much less strict than Measure 11 was, which called for secure facilities. I think that we need to maybe, try to operate outside the box of what we've done. I'm certainly not alluding to the fact that we'd have a Sheriff Arpaio type tent situation in Oregon, but I think that we could find a way to build facilities for these type of offenders who are lower risk offenders that cost much less than the type of facilities we're putting up today, such as the new facility at Deer Ridge.
I'm a father of 4. I have kids in the school system. I've lived in Germany, Japan, and I've traveled China. Our school system sucks here. Bottom line, we need more money for it. I hear people, other measures saying, cut taxes, cut school systems, spend more money for public safety. Bottom line is, from what I heard, is over $1 billion, and for 57, what is it, 500 million a year? I mean, those things are staggering. How many students can be educated with that money? That's my question. Where is that money going to come from?
Steve, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, the $1 billion that Steve's measure will cost is over a 5-year period. It's not in 1 year. Similarly, Measure 57, it's spread over a number of years, the cost of the measure, which is in the $400 million range. Look, that's a lot of money. It's absolutely correct that it's a lot of money. One of the things that I think these debates have shown is we're in a box where we're constantly fighting over whether we're going to spend money on schools or whether we're going to spend money on public safety. I have to say this, you're not going to have kids in school who are going to succeed if they come from backgrounds where they've been abused. You're not going to have kids who succeed in schools if they're not safe in their homes. And that is a reality. I mean, right now, 90% of our children who are abused or neglected so badly we have to take them away from their parents have a drug addict in the household. When you think about what causes child abuse and neglect in our state, it's overwhelmingly the problem of drug addiction. And we cannot get people into drug treatment in this state. We turn people away every day from drug treatment centers. We're talking about teenagers who want help and get turned away. We're talking about parents who go to drug treatment facilities and get turned away because they can't afford it, they don't have health insurance to pay for it, and we don't have enough funding to get them help. When you take a drug-addicted parent and say, sorry, we can't help you, and send them home to their children, it's not a surprise when those children wind up paying the price. So I agree 100% that we need to make sure that our schools are well funded, but we can't neglect public safety either. I mean, the reality is that kids pay the price. We got a child welfare report card grade for Oregon, and our grade was a D. And part of that is because we have very high child abuse levels, and the reported numbers have gone up every year. Methamphetamine is the #1 contributing factor to that, and we've got to do more to get more people into drug treatment and to get fewer people selling drugs on the street.
If I may, I think it's important to put this whole issue of schools versus public safety, schools versus prisons into perspective and talk about the reality of the budget. And believe me, I'm all for good schools. I'm all for education. I was lucky enough to get a good education in my life. But I learned the very hard way that if you don't have good public safety, if you don't have safe streets, if you don't have law enforcement, you know what? You can build all the schools you want. You can build all the great roads you want. You can have a lot of things at government, but you know what? It isn't really going to mean much. It really isn't. And I got to tell you, that's not my words. I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but that's Governor Kulingoski's words. He said that when he was inaugurated the first time. Now, here's the reality. We spend about $1.1 billion per biennium on the prison system. Okay? We spend $8 billion plus on the educational system. I'm talking about general fund and lottery now. But if you go to the all funds budget, we're spending over $18 billion on education in the state of Oregon. That's more than the general fund and lottery budget combined. So I think it's important for us to talk about realities here. And my mother always said, don't ever question the teacher, but I'm going to have to say to the teacher in the audience, the higher education budget is $1.5 billion. The all funds budget for higher education is $5.2 billion, and when I went to school, both those figures were more than $1.1 billion. Now, I'm sorry, maybe we can talk about it after the debate, but I think it's important to put these numbers in perspective.
Next question, please.
I was going to ask the two of you to comment on how Oregon's incarcerated population compares with other states. There's a perception that Oregon is getting to the point where we're incarcerating more people than any other state.
Since we have another question, let's try to keep to 45
Yeah,
seconds.
the bottom line is, yeah, there's people that think that Oregon has turned into a penal colony. I would just say this, a couple of things. Number one, I believe, and John might correct me, but I think we're 34th in the rate of incarceration in the United States right now. The other thing is this, is that when Measure 11 was passed, they said that we were going to need 19,000 new prison beds by the year 2006. Here we are in the year 2008, we have 13,700. They said by the year 2000 we were going to need 6,000 beds for Measure 11 in and of itself. Here we are in 2008, and we've used up 700 or 800 of those beds. I'd say this. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office made this comment about how they figured the cost of both these measures. They called it faulty, resulting in greatly exaggerated cost projections, incorrect assumptions, no accurate way to predict costs, and methods that were unreliable.
Did you want to respond or go to the next question?
You know, I'm happy to take the next question. I mean, just think about identity theft. We arrest someone, convict them, we put them back out on the street. They don't get drug treatment. We arrest them, we put them back out on the street, they don't get drug treatment. We arrest them a third time, they get convicted. There's no drug treatment, we put them out on the street. the catch and release approach costs a lot of money and doesn't accomplish anything. What we need to do is get our first-time offenders into serious drug treatment programs that have a good shot at getting them off their addiction. If that does not work and they continue to offend, we're going to have to put people in jail. We don't have an option there. If we just leave them out on the street as we're currently doing, you're just asking people to get victimized. And who is that? You know, it's overwhelmingly working people and poor people in the state who pay the price for our criminal justice policies. There are parts of the state that have some of the highest rates of identity theft in the entire nation. Some of them are in Alex's county, and we need to do something to address that.
I'll be quick. So first, just wanted to clarify that $5.5 billion spent on higher ed, most of those dollars are tuition dollars coming from students who are paying increasing tuition rates because the state has decreased the share they're investing in public education. So it's not quite fair to call that state spending. It's actually student spending that's hitting families and making it harder for people to access higher education. But my question was, you mentioned Governor Kulongoski. I believe he's opposing Measure 61, supporting Measure 57, and he called Measure 61, his words also, a gold-plated revolving door on our public safety system. And I just wonder if you had any response to those words from Governor Kulongoski.
Well, I
only
would
have time for 30 seconds.
I would say this: Governor Kulongoski made similar comments about Measure 11 when it passed, and they were all wrong. And I think the same thing will result here.
Concluding remarks?
As I say, John and I fundamentally agree with that something needs to be done. By the way, I very rarely correct my friend John because he's a lot smarter guy than I. But I'm not a leading crime advocate. I'm actually a crime victims advocate.
Did I say crime advocate?
And public safety advocate. I don't.
I'm subtly undercutting your.
I forgive him. He was out late last night. I know he had an event he had in Roseburg. Anyway, look. We've got a severe property crime problem, and it's been going on, as I said, for over 18 years now, 19 years. Measure 61 creates minimum mandatory sentences to take care of this. It's an accountability bill. It takes these people off the street. It deters people, and while they're in prison, they're not going to be able to commit these crimes. As I said before, there's nothing in Measure 61 that prohibits drug treatment. There's drug treatment programs in the prisons now, and they can be expanded. What will be interesting is if Measure 61 in fact wins, will the people that have advocated so hard for drug treatment still put that into the system? And why didn't they before this? So I would ask you to consider both measures closely, and please vote for Measure 61 and no on Measure 57.
John?
Thanks very much for having us here tonight. It's a great opportunity to talk to people. The property crime situation, our drug problem, and the child abuse it causes are things that I think we have to do a better job of addressing. I think Measure 57 strikes the right balance. It's got higher sentences for repeat property offenders, and it's also got a serious commitment to drug treatment. You cannot tackle crime with one arm tied behind your backs. You can't do good enforcement and not do good treatment and prevention programs, or we'll never, never make any progress on our criminal justice problems. Measure 57 is more fiscally responsible, but much more than that. It's a smart, tough way to fight crime. That's why it's backed by the district attorneys, the vast majority of them, and by the police chiefs, frontline police officers, and all of us would urge you to vote for 57 and not support Measure 61. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our speakers for coming from all around the state to inform us on the complicated issues of the ballot. This concludes the third part of the Brown Club of Oregon's ballot measure debates. Thank you.